When it comes to skiing and riding in the United States, the state of Oregon has long been a strong regional choice. That's why recent events in the state have been so alarming, with a business environment that has quietly become the most hostile in the country for ski resort operations. And due to developments in the state in recent weeks, there is a real possibility that every major ski resort in the state could soon be legally barred from operating. So how likely is the so-called nuclear scenario to actually happen? Well, in this video, we'll go through the series of events that made Oregon uniquely susceptible to the crisis it currently faces, whether any other states have ever faced similar issues, and how the state could feasibly dig itself out of the hole it now finds itself in, despite the fact that it currently may not have the political will to do so. Let's jump right into one of the most underreported impending catastrophes in the American ski industry. The crisis that Oregon currently faces primarily boils down to one factor: liability insurance. For many decades, ski resort liability insurance worked generally the same in Oregon as it did in other states. Liability waivers have long served as the legal backbone of the outdoor recreation industry, allowing ski resorts and adventure operators to function in high-risk environments without the constant threat of catastrophic lawsuits. In most Western states, these waivers are enforceable so long as they're clear and voluntary, shielding operators from claims arising from what's known as ordinary negligence, let's say catching an edge, hitting a tree, or colliding with another skier or rider. This legal clarity gives insurers confidence, enables resorts to keep their premiums in check, and one might argue also helps keep lift ticket rates at practical levels. But in Oregon about a decade ago, a series of legal events completely upended all of that. In 2006, 18-year-old Miles Bagley was snowboarding at Central Oregon's Mount Bachelor when he hit a jump in the resort's terrain park. Unfortunately, the landing went horribly wrong. Bagley suffered a severe spinal cord injury that left him paralyzed from the waist down. He later argued the jump was defectively designed and unsafe. Like most other snowboarders and skiers, Bagley had signed a liability waiver when he purchased his Easy Pass. The agreement released Mount Bachelor from responsibility for injuries, even those resulting from negligence. Despite this, Bagley filed a lawsuit claiming the resort had acted recklessly in the building of the terrain feature. What followed was a years-long legal battle that culminated in a landmark 2014 Oregon Supreme Court decision, Bagley versus Mount Bachelor. In a ruling that had significant implications for the state's outdoor recreation industry, the court declared Mount Bachelor's liability waiver unenforceable. The court determined that the contract was both unconscionable and against public policy, effectively invalidating essentially every liability waiver used in the state at the time. The justices emphasized three main points in their decision. Number one, the waiver was a contract of adhesion, or in other words, non-negotiable and imposed by a party with disproportionate power. Number two, skiers and riders had no ability to modify the terms and thus no meaningful choice. And three, perhaps most critically, the waiver attempted to release the resort from liability even for its own negligent conduct. The court found these circumstances contrary to Oregon's legal principles, arguing it disincentivized safety and violated the public interest. On paper, the ruling was intended to preserve legal recourse for seriously injured parties, but unfortunately, it eventually became clear that the decision, while presumably well-intentioned, had taken things a little bit too far. Over the next decade, Oregon's ski industry entered a treacherous state. With liability waivers rendered largely unenforceable by the Bagley ruling, insurance companies began viewing the state as toxic territory. This came as injured patrons at ski resorts and even some summer recreation users started suing more frequently, with damage demands climbing into the tens of millions. The first major post-Bagley case took shape in 2016, when a mountain biker at Mount Hood Ski Bowl was paralyzed after hitting a drainage rut and colliding with an unpadded wooded post along a downhill trail. Even though the incident occurred during the summer, not the winter season, the case had major implications for the liability environment surrounding outdoor recreation in Oregon. In 2022, a jury awarded the rider over $11 million in damages, ruling that Ski Bowl had failed to take reasonable safety precautions despite signage and waiver protections. It was one of the largest single verdicts against a recreation operator in Oregon history, and in response, Ski Bowl completely shut down their bike park operations and hasn't restarted them since. Mount Bachelor also became a focal point for legal scrutiny, with two $15 million wrongful death suits following a pair of 2018 tree well fatalities, and a nearly $50 million claim filed after a child's 2021 death after sliding into rocks on an icy run. Even community-oriented areas like Mount Ashland, despite facing no public lawsuits, reported being overwhelmed by rising insurance costs. That resort's general manager noted a whopping 129% increase in liability premiums over 12 years, with another 30% spike expected in 2025. But it wasn't just increasing premiums that occurred. By early 2025, brokers reported that fewer and fewer firms were willing to even consider underwriting ski resorts in Oregon. Outdoor recreation companies formed coalitions like Protect Oregon Recreation to plead for legal reform, warning that without enforceable waivers or other liability shields, the state's entire outdoor recreation industry, not just ski resorts, but also including bike parks, rock gyms, river rafting companies, and plenty of other activities, was at risk. It's also worth touching on a couple of other indicators that have shown just how much these legal and financial pressures have had an impact on the state. One thing a typical visitor might call out is the largely unpredictable terrain openings at the ski resorts in the state. Despite reasonably strong snowfall most seasons, resorts like Mount Bachelor and Mount Hood Meadows are consistently among the least resilient in terms of terrain access, and in fact, in one of our recent analyses, we found Oregon to be dead last for reliability among major ski regions. Now we do have to caveat there's no doubt that weather plays a major role here. Oregon's maritime precipitation and volcanic geography can complicate slope cover and safe operations, but many in the industry believe the state's legal environment only makes things worse. It's not a stretch to believe that the resorts could be acting overly cautiously given the threat of excruciating lawsuits, keeping trails closed longer than necessary out of fear that a misstep could result in litigation. Anecdotally, the Summit Express lift at Mount Bachelor, which directly served the terrain where the 2021 death took place, was closed continuously for a period of approximately a month later that same season. And it's easy to see the resort opting to err on the side of legal caution given those circumstances. So if it's been over a decade since the Bagley ruling, why are we bringing all of this up now? Well, in June 2025, the Oregon insurance situation went from bad to worse. Safehold Special Risk, a major ski industry insurer that covered resorts like Mount Hood Meadows, Timberline Lodge, and Cooper Spur, announced it was pulling out of Oregon entirely. In doing so, it said Oregon had become unworkable. Although the state accounted for only a fraction of its clients, it produced a whopping half of its payouts between $1 and $10 million. That exit left Oregon with just one viable ski resort insurer, Mountain Guard. Mountain Guard, which is a legacy provider with national reach, has continued to serve the state, but not without concern. Its leadership made clear that a single massive verdict could force them to reassess. And should Mountain Guard exit as well, no other insurer may be willing to step in. And because without insurance, resorts can't legally operate, this move would completely and immediately shut down every single Oregon ski resort. So given this pending catastrophe, has Oregon's government made any efforts to address it? Well, at least claiming to recognize the growing crisis, Oregon's state legislature has proposed several bills over the last decade, all aiming to restore partial legal protection for outdoor recreation operators. In 2025, the most promising was Senate Bill 1196, which would have allowed liability waivers to cover ordinary negligence, but not gross or reckless misconduct. A similar House bill, H. Bill 3140, had the same aim. Supporters said this was a common-sense compromise already in place in most other Western states. It would have brought Oregon in line with its neighbors, while still allowing injured parties to sue in cases of gross negligence or willful misconduct. The bills did initially gain momentum, but despite committee approval and apparent legislative support, neither SB 1196 nor HB 3140 were brought to a floor vote before the end of the 2025 session. This could have been in part due to the fact that trial lawyer groups lobbied heavily against the reform, arguing it would strip injured parties of their right to sue and reduce incentives for resorts to maintain safe conditions. And in the end, legislative leadership declined to advance the bills to the floor, effectively killing them. This failure was a huge disappointment for resort operators and insurance carriers alike. It marked the third time in 10 years that similar legislation had failed in Oregon, and with this specific defeat, the state's recreation industry moved to the precarious point at which it finds itself today. In fact, Safehold, which was the insurer that just pulled out, had explicitly warned lawmakers that it would exit the state if these reforms didn't pass. When these bills died, Safehold made good on that promise, pulling out of Oregon and sending a clear message that the state would pay a steep price for its inaction. What happens if Oregon's last major ski insurer, Mountain Guard, pulls out of the state? Well, the effects would be both immediate and far-reaching. Ski resorts that operate on Forest Service land, including but not limited to Mount Bachelor, Mount Hood Meadows, and Timberline Lodge, are legally required to carry general liability insurance to maintain their permits. Without it, they'd be forced to shut down operations overnight. And that sudden stop wouldn't just hit the slopes, entire communities would feel the aftershocks. Towns like Government Camp, Ashland, and Bend depend on consistent winter and summer visitation to support their tourism economies. Hotels, restaurants, gear shops, ski schools, and shuttle services would all be thrown into crisis. The liability issue stretches beyond skiing and riding too. Rock gyms, rafting companies, zipline tours, mountain bike parks, and even climbing guides all rely on similar liability protections and insurance to stay afloat. If Oregon can't find a fix, the state's outdoor recreation economy could begin to unravel. But if Mountain Guard does leave, would the shutdown be permanent? Well, despite the catastrophic consequences in the interim, probably not. A complete collapse of Oregon's ski industry would force the state's hand. While lawmakers have failed to pass legal reform in previous sessions so far, a full-scale closure would almost certainly bring enormous political pressure to act immediately. We'd almost certainly see a fast-track bill to reauthorize liability waivers for ordinary negligence, something like SB 1196, which was proposed this past session, and likely additional action through an emergency legislative session to get the industry back on its feet. However, a fix would not restore operations overnight. Insurers that have already fled the state may not return immediately, especially if legal uncertainty lingers. The state might have to lean on short-term solutions like government-backed risk pools or cooperative insurance programs. And even if these stopgaps work, rebuilding trust with national insurers could take years. So while Oregon ski resorts might not be shuttered forever, the disruption would be deeply damaging and the recovery could be long and uneven. So has any other state ever faced something like this? Well, Oregon's path forward might seem uncertain, but it's not without precedent. In fact, just next door in Idaho, the ski industry recently faced a similarly dire moment and ultimately managed to stabilize the situation before it spiraled out of control. The situation in Idaho effectively began in 2023 when the state Supreme Court allowed a wrongful death lawsuit against Sun Valley to proceed, despite the state's long-standing Ski Area Liability Act. The case involved a skier who crashed into a snowmaking tower and suffered fatal injuries, and the court's initial ruling opened the door to potential jury trials for incidents that had traditionally been considered part of the inherent risk of skiing and riding. The decision sparked serious concern among resort operators who feared a flood of litigation and a potential loss of insurance coverage. In one particular case, Bogus Basin even began adding extra signage around equipment purely as a legal precaution. But in a rare about-face, the Idaho Supreme Court reversed course in mid-2025. The justices determined that because the hazard was clearly marked and padded, the skier had assumed the risk, meaning the resort was not liable under Idaho's statute. The decision reinstated critical liability protections, and lawmakers are now working to clarify and strengthen the law further in the next legislative session. Just a few years earlier, Idaho also passed legislation upholding waiver enforceability for outfitters and guides, signaling a broader commitment to protecting the outdoor recreation economy. So what can Oregon learn from this? Well, even when the legal foundation starts to crack, a coordinated response from courts and lawmakers can restore balance. While Oregon's situation is arguably further along and more severe, there's still a window for action. So just how long is this window for action we just mentioned? Well, based on the current legal landscape and timeline of active cases, the threat is probably not quite as immediate as the next few months. However, the lack of urgency with which the Oregon legislature seems to be handling this means they could be setting themselves up for a historic fumble. So, realistically speaking, what could actually happen that would cause Mountain Guard to leave, and as a result trigger a statewide ski resort shutdown? Well, as we mentioned earlier, the company did cite that a single major verdict could cause it to leave the state, and a few major cases making their way through the legal system could very well be the nuclear verdict that would force the company to pull out. Take, for example, what's arguably the most high-profile active case, a $6.2 million lawsuit filed in early 2025 by a ski coach who was struck by a snowmobile at Mount Hood Meadows. While the case is likely months away from a settlement or trial, if that, it is significant, and it could result in a large payout. In addition, the wrongful death lawsuit against Mount Bachelor, which as we mentioned earlier seeks nearly $50 million in damages, is still winding through the legal process after being filed in August 2022. There could be other non-public cases or other factors that could cause Mountain Guard to leave in the coming months as well. For example, the Mount Hood Ski Bowl case that forced the mountain to shut down its bike park wasn't even reported on until the 8-figure verdict came down. So how should we objectively look at these cases now? Well, for the state of Oregon, there's some good news and there's some bad news. The good news is that while these cases remain a looming threat, they're unlikely to reach a verdict or settlement before this fall's insurance renewal period. Most Oregon ski resorts operate on annual insurance cycles that renew in September or October, so unless something unexpected happens, it's likely that Mountain Guard will remain in the Oregon market for at least one more winter, albeit probably with pretty unfavorable terms to the resorts. But here's the bad news. The threat hasn't gone away, and the major lawsuits currently in motion could very well result in 8-figure payouts over the next 12 to 18 months. If something like this were to occur, we could very well see Mountain Guard exit the state before the 2026-2027 season. But perhaps the most concerning part of this whole situation is there's very little chance the state will act in time to prevent that outcome. Oregon's next legislative session won't be until February 2026, which is already over 6 months from now at the time of this recording. But in even years, the state's legislative session is a paltry 35 days long, practically only allowing for priorities like budgets, transportation, housing, and public safety to be actioned upon, and making it exceedingly unlikely that liability reform would even be considered. It is worth caveating that in recent days, an emergency session was called for this upcoming August. However, it's narrowly focused on transportation funding and transit layoffs, so the chances of liability insurance being taken up are essentially slim to none. So unless another emergency session is called or a surprise court ruling comes about, the legal environment is unlikely to improve before February 2027, and by that point, there's a concerningly real chance it will be too late. So the collapse of Oregon's ski resort liability protections was set in motion by a tragic injury and what one could reasonably assume was a well-meaning court ruling. But a decade later, the lack of a legislative fix threatens the survival of the state's entire ski industry. Ultimately, the sky isn't falling quite right now, and it's more likely than not that Oregon's ski industry will have one more season of insurance left. However, if no action is taken soon, the window to avoid a full-scale coverage collapse in the coming months could close fast. For now, all eyes are on the legislature, the courts, and the lone insurer left. So with this all being said, is there any way you can take action? Well, the biggest way is if you live in Oregon, contact your state legislators and tell them how you feel. If you don't live in Oregon, consider supporting organizations like Protect Oregon Recreation, which are actively lobbying for legal reform in this space and could use all the help they can get. And finally, no matter where you live, tell your friends and family about this. The more people who put pressure on the key players here, the more likely lawmakers are to prioritize solutions before there isn't a ski season anymore. Speaking of next year's ski season, one place that almost certainly won't have its resorts shut down by a lack of insurance in 2026 is Washington State. That's why we're incredibly excited to share that we've got you covered. Join our team and other like-minded enthusiasts on a ski trip to Washington State's Alpental and Summit at Snoqualmie, which are home to not just some of the most diverse and conveniently located terrain areas in the Pacific Northwest, but also some of the most challenging steeps in the entire country. And because we want this to be the best ski weekend you've ever been on, this isn't just some ordinary ski trip. We've rented out an entire chalet, coordinated transportation from Seattle, Vancouver, and Portland, and arranged to have meals cooked in-house throughout the entire trip. And the best part, this trip is an absolute steal, with early bird pricing of just $695 through August 15th. It's not every day you get to go on an all-inclusive ski trip for that price without having to plan literally anything. Spots are filling up fast, so if you want to put down a deposit and see the full itinerary, or see testimonials from previous trips, check out the link in the description below. If you found this information helpful, be sure to like and subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss any of our content. And special thanks to our Peak patrons. For more information on skiing in Oregon and over 100 destinations around the world, check out peakrankings.com. See you for the next one.